Thousands of bodies left without burial, the smell of burning that stretched over Judea for weeks, and screams that, according to eyewitnesses, drowned out thunder itself. How could it happen that a magnificent city, considered invulnerable, turned into ashes, and more than 1 million of its inhabitants were wiped off the face of the earth? But to understand why the Romans went for such monstrous destruction, one must return to the origins, to the spark that turned the entire province into a fiery cauldron. In the mid-60s of the 1st century of the new era, Judea was seething. The taxes collected by Roman procurators were becoming increasingly heavy. The chronicler Josephus Flavius wrote that discontent had been accumulating for years, like water behind a dam, and then in the year 66, this dam collapsed. Jewish rebels expelled the Roman garrison from Jerusalem, and for a brief moment it seemed that freedom was near. These first fighters, ready to die for their faith, called themselves zealots. With their name, Zealous Ones, they emphasized that they were fighting not only against Rome, but also for the purity of faith. The zealots were not simply warriors, these were fanatics, ready to kill anyone they suspected of betrayal. Their desperate determination resembled fire that burns everything around, even its own. But in Judea, more than one fire was raging. Inside Jerusalem itself, disputes flared up between different groups of rebels. Some sought open war, others looked for negotiations, still others killed both the former and the latter. The city was splitting from within, while the most powerful army of that time was approaching its gates. The Roman Empire could not allow itself such a challenge. Emperor Nero entrusted the suppression of the revolt to the military commander Vespasian, an experienced legate who had been through dozens of campaigns. His son Titus accompanied him as a trusted tribune, learning the art of war from his father. Sources say that they moved methodically, step by step, turning every Jewish fortress into a pile of stones. And here appears the first key term. The battle formation called turtle was called testudo. When Roman legionaries raised shields above themselves and to the sides, they turned into an impenetrable iron roof. Such formation allowed them to approach fortress walls step by step under a rain of arrows and stones. Archaeologists have found depictions of this formation on bas-reliefs, confirming the accuracy of ancient descriptions. The image of the Roman advance resembled a slowly moving steamroller. No matter how many arrows or stones fell from above, the line of shields moved forward and inexorably crushed everything in its path. Each fortress of Judea became another step towards Jerusalem, like in a chess game where the Romans methodically cornered their opponent. Jerusalem remained the last and main prize. But what awaits us ahead does not resemble a battle between two armies. This will be a story about how despair can turn into madness, and faith into flame that devours its own home. And it is precisely here that the main question arises. Who will turn out to be more terrible for the city's inhabitants, the Roman legions outside the walls, or their own brothers inside them? In the spring of the 70th year of the new era, the first dusty columns appeared on Jerusalem's horizon. The rumble of tens of thousands of sandals on the rocky road was heard long before the inhabitants saw the gleaming armor. Thus began the siege that historians would call one of the most brutal in human history. But before the city found itself in a deadly trap, the Romans conducted colossal preparation. According to Josephus Flavius, under Titus's command were 4 legions, approximately 60,000 soldiers, if one counts auxiliary troops and allies. For understanding, this is the population of an average modern city, but each of these people was a professional warrior, trained for survival and killing. Legionaries carried about 40 kilograms of equipment on themselves: armor, weapons, rations and construction tools. This burden is comparable to a tourist backpack, but imagine that instead of a walk, a bloody battle awaits you. And here it is worth introducing the term. The chief officer commanding a legion was called a legate. He was not simply a military man, but also a politician, close to the emperor. It was precisely the legates who were responsible for discipline and fighting spirit, turning thousands of people into a single living mechanism. Sources emphasize that a legate managed not only battles but also logistics, distribution of provisions, construction of camps, planning of marches. Every movement of the Roman army resembled a mechanical operation. Archaeological excavations of camps show that they were built according to a strict plan: straight streets, division into quarters, a moat, and rampart around. In the evening, the army turned an empty field into a city, where everything was organized down to the smallest detail. Thus, a psychological gulf was created. Inside the camp, order and iron discipline. Beyond its boundaries, the chaos of Jerusalem, where factions, warring parties, cut each other right within the sacred walls. The most important part of preparation was provisions. The Romans brought with them enormous supplies of grain and wine, as well as herds of animals. According to calculations of modern historians, one legionary required no less than 800 grams of grain per day. That is, 4 legions consumed daily about 50 tons of bread. To ensure this flow, caravans and warehouses in the surrounding areas were used, which turned the war into a colossal logistical task. The image of this army is striking, as if the earth itself trembled under the weight of the human machine. Military engineers went ahead of the columns, clearing roads and preparing positions. Behind them moved infantry units, camp builders, baggage trains with provisions, and siege machines. Horses dragged wooden towers and battering rams disassembled into parts. All this looked like a moving city, where everyone had their role. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem reigned a different order, or rather, its complete absence. Zealots and other factions fought for power inside the city. Streets were flooded with blood from internal massacres. Granaries were set on fire by the rebels themselves so that enemies would not get supplies. Flavius writes that, even in the face of a common threat, they continued the slaughter, as if not noticing the Romans who were advancing on the walls. The Romans prepared for the siege as coldly as for training. Centurions, middle-rank officers, ensured that each soldier knew his place in formation and task. Trumpet signals ensured coordination. At one sound, the legion turned, at another, it built the turtle, at a third, it prepared for attack. This order produced an impression of irresistible force, and at the same time had a demoralizing effect on the enemy. Roman military engineers occupied a special place. Their work was no less important than sword strikes. They erected embankments, catapults, and ballista, enormous machines that hurled stone projectiles weighing up to 50 kilograms. Imagine how such a projectile crashes into a wall with a roar, scattering stones and people. These strikes were supposed to break not only walls, but also the psyche of the defenders. And yet, ahead of them awaited not an ordinary stone fortress. Jerusalem had a triple belt of walls, towering towers, and an inaccessible location on hills. Even the Romans understood this would not be a quick victory, but an exhausting struggle. The city was rotting inside, the army was approaching from outside, and in the air hung the question, who would fall first, the walls of Jerusalem or the people living behind them? The answer to it would begin to manifest with the first strikes of siege machines. At dawn, when the first rays of sun fell on the white stone of Jerusalem's walls, the Roman army lined up in battle formation. This was the beginning of the siege, and even Josephus Flavius, who was then inside the city, wrote that the gleam of weapons blinded the eyes. Outside stood perfect order. Banners swayed in rhythm with drums, trumpets gave signals, and tens of thousands of people moved like one body. Inside the city, however, chaos reigned. Rebels killed each other, and the noise of this slaughter overlaid the rumble of the approaching army. The Romans began by surrounding the city. Titus positioned the legions by sectors, like a surgeon placing an iron hoop on a wounded man. One legion stood to the north, another to the west, yet another to the east, and the fourth occupied positions to the south. Thus, Jerusalem found itself in a ring. No one could leave and no one could enter. Here it is worth introducing the term. The fortified line around a besieged city was called circumvallation. This was a wall and moat built by the Romans themselves to completely cut off the enemy from the outside world. Sources indicate that the length of this line around Jerusalem reached 7 kilometers, and it was erected in just 3 days. Archaeologists have found traces of such fortifications in other places, which confirms the incredible speed and precision of Roman engineers. The image of this line like a noose tightening around the throat. At first, supplies still remained in the city, but each day the noose became tighter. People behind the walls saw how before their eyes a foreign army was building a second wall and realized they found themselves in a cage from which escape was impossible. The first Roman strikes fell on the outer walls. Siege towers, higher than the city fortifications, advanced on the stone masonry, quaking with wooden beams and clanging with iron. Behind them moved battering rams, enormous logs with metal tips. They were called rams, and each collision with the stone wall resonated with a rumble that was heard throughout the entire city. The resistance was desperate. Jewish warriors threw burning torches from above, rolled boulders down, doused enemies with boiling tar. Their screams mixed with the roar of catapults and the screech of stone projectiles steering through the air. According to eyewitnesses, this was like an endless thunderstorm, where lightning was replaced by fire arrows and thunder by ram strikes. The Romans responded with cold discipline. When approaching the walls, legionaries folded shields into testudo, an iron shell that protected from arrows and spears. This movement, perfected by thousands of training sessions, produced a terrifying effect, as if a bronze turtle was crawling up to the very wall, while stones and fire uselessly showered down on it from above. But the city did not surrender. Moreover, internal strife continued even during the attack. Flavius writes that one night some rebels set fire to granaries with grain so that another group would not get it. As a result, residents lost part of their last food supplies, while months of blockade awaited them ahead. This act of madness was compared to how a person sets fire to the house in which he hides from enemies. Titus tried to accelerate the surrender of the city through psychological pressure. Ballistae hurled stone projectiles with such force that walls trembled and people were torn to pieces. Chronicles say that the projectiles were whitened with lime, and they were seen still in flight, white spheres flying from the heavens like divine punishment. This image remained in memory for long. Sky vomiting stones that fell directly into the heart of the sacred city. Meanwhile, the Romans strengthened their positions. Every evening after battles, they erected new embankments and moved machines closer to the walls. Soldiers worked with pickaxes and shovels with the same persistence with which they fought with swords. For them, the siege was not only a battle, but also construction work, where success depended on precision and persistence. Panic began in the city. People saw how walls slowly crumbled under ram strikes and understood time was running out. But at the same time, they feared their own leaders more than the enemies outside. Zealots punished with death those who tried to leave the city or even spoke of capitulation. Residents found themselves trapped between two forces, the Roman hammer and internal madness, and yet the decisive blow was still ahead. The initial clashes were only a prologue to the hell that would break out the moment when walls would fall and legions would burst into the city. The only question was who would endure longer, walls of stone or hearts of flesh. In the summer of the 70th year of the new era, Jerusalem turned into a boiling cauldron. Behind the walls, the Roman machine, precise and inexorable. Inside, hunger, rage and despair. And it was precisely at this moment that the real catastrophe began, which Josephus Flavius described with pain, as if trying to warn future generations. The city itself became an enemy to its inhabitants. Hunger struck first. Grain supplies that could have sustained the population for months were destroyed in civil war. People ate leather belts, dry grasses, and even tree bark. The historian writes that on the streets one could see bodies withered to bones. The silence of night was interrupted by moans when mothers had no strength to feed children. This silence, filled with hunger, was more terrible than the roar of siege machines. The Romans saw that the city was weakening and increased pressure. They began erecting enormous embankments to bring towers right up to the walls. Tens of thousands of hands dug earth, dragged stones and logs. They worked day and night under cover of testudo. For opponents, this looked like the appearance of a second mountain at the foot of their city. Here appears a key term. The wooden tower on wheels, higher than city walls, was called turris. These towers allowed Romans to shower defenders with arrows from above and lay bridges directly onto walls. Contemporaries wrote that when a tower approached, it was like a moving fortress that nothing could stop. Rebels tried to burn the Turis, but Romans covered them with wet animal hides so that fire would not take the wood. The picture was ghastly. Enormous structures covered with skin rolled forward, reflecting the flame of torches. The city saw how a monster was advancing, slowly and inevitably. Meanwhile, inside, things were happening even more terrible. Hunger broke all moral boundaries. Josephus Flavius tells that a mother killed and ate her own child, a story that shocked even Romans accustomed to cruelty. This case became a symbol of despair, and rumors about it quickly spread through the city. Resistance was turning into madness. Titus understood that Jerusalem could be taken only through sequential destruction of walls. The first line fell, then the second. Each fall was accompanied by a storm of screams, ram strikes, and catapult screeches. When towers collapsed, it seemed that the city itself shuddered. Dust shrouded the sky and the sun hid in grey gloom. The Romans acted methodically. They captured a section of wall, secured it, and moved farther. Centurions raised trumpets, giving signals for advance, and hundreds of soldiers went forward step by step. For city inhabitants, this trumpet sound became a symbol of death. Each time it sounded, another assault approached them. The image of the siege in these days resembled a slaughter where there was no place for mercy. People rushed to the gates in desperate attempts to break out, but Roman patrols intercepted them. Those captured were crucified on crosses right before the walls. Chronicles claim that crosses became so numerous that there was not enough space for them. For the city's defenders, this was a warning. There was no way out. Nevertheless, the rebels did not surrender. They broke through to siege machines, tried to set fire to embankments, fought on wall ruins. Their ferocity amazed even the Romans. But forces were unequal. Behind each Roman warrior stood discipline and iron organization, while chaos ruled in the city. The culmination was the fall of the third, final wall. Roman towers rose higher, rams broke through breaches, and legionaries burst inside. Streets filled with battle. Every house turned into a fortress, every crossroads into a battlefield. But this was only a prologue to what awaited the city at its very heart, at Temple Mount. It was precisely there that the outcome of the entire war was to be decided. It was precisely there that the last defenders and last hopes flowed. And the question hung in the air. Would Titus be able to preserve the sacred place, or would the flame of war consume it too? The answer would become one of the most tragic moments in all ancient history. When the Romans burst into the center of Jerusalem, before them stood the city's main symbol, the temple. An enormous structure of white stone with golden decorations gleamed under the sun, like a luminary that had fallen to earth. For Jews, this was the heart of faith. For Romans, the last bastion of resistance. It was precisely around it that the climax of the entire siege unfolded. Josephus Flavius claimed that Titus supposedly wanted to preserve the temple. He understood its destruction would become a symbol of eternal enmity. But the chaos of battle proved stronger than orders. When Roman legionaries broke through to the temple gates, one of them threw a torch. Fire engulfed beams and fabrics, and soon flames grew to the heavens. Even the Roman officers themselves, as chronicles write, tried to stop the soldiers, but the fury of battle was unstoppable. Here it is worth introducing the term. The military engineer responsible for siege machines and fortification was called prefect of the camp. It was precisely such people who helped the Romans break through walls and bring towers to the temple. But on that day, no engineering calculations mattered anymore. All-consuming fire engulfed the city. The picture that sources describe strikes the imagination. Gold that decorated the temple melted from the heat and flowed into cracks between stones. Flames soared higher than towers, reflecting in the bronze shields of legionaries. The rumble of collapsing columns mixed with screams of thousands of people driven onto Temple Mount. For eyewitnesses, this resembled the end of the world. The Romans spared no one. Sources speak of hundreds of thousands killed. Josephus Flavius claims that the number of dead exceeded 1 million, an incredible figure that modern researchers consider inflated, but even its symbolism is horrifying. City streets were littered with bodies, and blood flowed in streams down the temple steps. Warriors grabbed everything valuable they could carry and burned houses one after another. The image of this destruction resembles an enormous bonfire into which an entire people was thrown. Smoke shrouded the sky and the sun turned into a red disk. Birds did not fly over the city, and even the wind, it seemed, carried the smell of death in all directions. But the most terrible thing was that captives faced torture and slavery. Thousands of young people were sent to Roman mines or gladiator arenas. Children were sold in markets like things. The elderly and sick were killed immediately. Those who survived lost their home forever. The Romans celebrated. For them, this was a grandiose victory worthy of triumph. Titus returned to Rome, where he was met as a hero, and the captured sacred relics, the golden menorah and other temple treasures, marched in the victor's column. To this day, the Arch of Titus stands in Rome, depicting these trophies. Archaeology confirms what Flavius wrote. Victory was turned into stone so it would not be forgotten. And yet, for the Romans themselves, this was not only a triumph but also a lesson. The destruction of Jerusalem showed that even the most powerful army could encounter fanatical resistance that did not fear death. Since then, Roman generals began to consider not only walls and weapons, but also the spirit of those who defend their home. The city lay in ruins. The temple, symbol of the Jewish people's faith, was wiped off the face of the earth. Inhabitants were killed or enslaved. In place of shrines remained only ash and emptiness. Flavius wrote, "If ruins did not remain here and there, it would be hard to believe that a great city once stood here." Thus ended the siege, but its echoes would be heard for centuries. The diaspora would scatter across the world, the Jewish people would lose their shrine, and Rome would assert power over the East. But along with this, victory would also breed new uprisings and new wars. For the ashes of Jerusalem would become the seed from which thirst for vengeance would grow. And here arises the question, if even such walls and such faith fell under the Roman hammer, what can withstand the empire's force? But even more important is another, what price does the victor pay, turning a city into ashes? After the temple's destruction, Jerusalem's streets turned into a silent cemetery. Stone blocks lay mixed with bodies, the smell of smoke and decay stood for weeks. Josephus Flavius wrote that the city was so completely destroyed that to a passerby it seemed, "Great Jerusalem never stood here." This moment became a point of no return, both for Jews and for Rome. Archaeological excavations confirm these words. Discovered layers of ash, charred beams and cracked stone blocks date precisely to the 70th year of the new era. Even after 20 centuries, scientists see traces of the fire that destroyed the sacred center. And here the term is important, the ceremonial celebration in Rome, when the victor displayed spoils and prisoners, was called triumph. Titus received such a triumph. Jewish captives marched through Rome's streets, and the golden menorah from the temple was put on display. To this day, the relief on Titus's arch preserves this image, like a stone frame from that tragedy. But for the people who lost their home, this triumph meant the beginning of millennia of exile. Jerusalem ceased to be the center of their life, and it was then that the diaspora was born. The empire celebrated victory, but for the future world this was a moment of new history. Faith, deprived of the temple, had to find other forms to survive. The image of the finale is terrible in its silence. Where trumpets sounded, where catapults roared and thousands of people screamed, emptiness remained. But this emptiness is louder than any sound. It became a symbol that no wall and no faith can withstand without unity. And now, when you know how a city considered eternal was wiped off the face of the earth, ask yourself the question, what keeps us, modern people, from the same destruction? Will we be able, in the hour of trial, to show the same steadfastness, but avoid the madness that destroyed Jerusalem? The story of the siege ends, but its lessons remain. Rome showed the power of iron discipline, and Jerusalem the power of desperate faith. And only you can decide which of these forces is closer to you.